Am I to believe that my son stood up for the first time in his life, just because you danced?" The words of a millionaire echoed through his multi-million-dollar mansion. It was an accusation, not a question, that reverberated through the grand house. Facing the millionaire was the new maid, who had no degree and even less experience. For 7 years, he had used his money to hire the best doctors and the most modern therapies, but he could not buy a single step. Now, a miracle had occurred right in his living room, and the instigator was just a spontaneous dance to a soul music tune. It was a truth too ordinary to accept, yet too miraculous to ignore. 7-year-old Theo Prescott lived in his own world. It wasn't that he couldn't speak, he was simply and inexplicably silent. He had never laughed out loud or screamed, not even during painful physical therapy sessions. Even when he fell and split his lip, he didn't cry, he just stared, always watching, always listening, always silent. Dozens of specialists had tried everything, but all their efforts were in vain. Charles, his father, had spent immense amounts of money, but the boy remained there on his chair, as still as a statue. Theo's mother had left when he was 2, unable to accept the reality that her son would live with his limitations for his entire life. She walked away, leaving Charles to bury himself in work to numb the loneliness. The only person who stayed was the housekeeper, Elma, but even she eventually complained that she was getting too old to manage everything. That's when she recommended a woman, someone very different, not a nurse and not a nanny, just a woman with a lot of life experience who knew how to keep a house neat and tidy. "Her name is Nia Traylor," Elma said. "She's not fancy, but she has a good heart." Charles didn't care about a good heart. He needed someone who would follow all the rules, stick to a schedule, keep the house clean, and not make things any worse. Still, he nodded in agreement. A week later, Nia arrived. She had only one suitcase full of old clothes, a box of vinyl records, and a plastic-framed photo of her 2 sons. Theo did not say a single word to Nia when she arrived, and she didn't say much either. She simply looked straight into the boy's eyes, smiled softly, and said, "You don't have to talk, little one. I'll do the talking for you." And she did. Every morning and every afternoon, she filled the house with stories about Georgia, about raising her sons alone, and with the warm sounds of soul music. Charles only recognized the miracle when Theo stood up that morning, but what he did not know was that something much deeper had been happening in the days leading up to it. The first thing Nia noticed about Theo was not his wheelchair, but his eyes. She called them old man's eyes, the way Southerners describe a child who has carried too much sorrow. His gaze was not empty, but seemed held back, as if he was waiting for a reason to care about the world. Theo observed everything. He noticed how Nia moved the cereal box, how she folded towels differently than Elma, and listened to her humming as she cooked. He did not speak, he just quietly watched, tilting his head slightly whenever she passed by. This didn't bother Nia. On the contrary, it reminded her of her youngest son, Lenel. Lenel was quiet, just like that, she said, as she cracked eggs. He didn't talk until he was 4. He'd just sit there, eyes wide open, watching everything like he was grading the world. Theo simply blinked. Nia continued. Of course, once he started talking, he never stopped. One time he dreamed our dog robbed a bank with an ice cream cone. I told him, "Boy, that's the silliest thing I've ever heard." From the hallway, Theo let out a small, quiet puff of air. It might have been a laugh, or it might not have been. Nia didn't push him. She just kept talking as if he were responding. She talked non-stop while dusting, scrubbing the walls, or pushing the mop. She told him stories about Lenel frying bacon with an iron, about humid summers without air conditioning where they had to sleep with wet towels, or about her mother's peach cobbler recipe that she could never get quite right. "You know what I learned," Nia said as she peeled a potato. "People think you talk to connect, but you're different." She turned and looked at Theo. "You listen. I can feel it." Theo didn't look away, but simply gave a slight nod. Nia smiled, her eyes welling up with tears. That single nod meant more to her than any complete sentence ever could. The following days passed peacefully. Nia started playing her old vinyl records whenever she cleaned. Each morning, the music of Sam Cooke, Aretha, or the staple singers would fill the house. Not too loud, but just enough to make the rooms feel warm. Theo sat by the window, watching quietly. He watched Nia wipe the windows, humming slightly off-key and dancing around the coffee table with a rag in her hand. One day, Nia looked up and caught Theo tapping his fingers against the arm of his chair. It was a very subtle movement, almost imperceptible, but there was a rhythm to it. "Hey, little man," she said. "You got a little rhythm in you, don't you?" Theo froze, his wide eyes looking up at her as if he had just been caught doing something wrong. Nia didn't laugh or make a big deal of it. She simply said, "That's a good thing. A very good thing." The next day, Nia left the living room door a little wider and turned the music up slightly. She slowed her dancing, as if she were waiting for someone to join her. Theo still didn't follow along, but he was watching. Meanwhile, Charles was completely oblivious to the changes taking place. He had grown accustomed to the silence, and now considered Nia to be just background noise. "Is she working out?" Charles asked Gina. "Everything is in order. Theo seems calmer." "Good. Keep her on." Charles didn't care how she was doing it. He didn't ask how she was accomplishing these things. He didn't care. Theo, however, did. Because every story, every off-key note from Nia was planting something deep within him. Not hope, but familiarity. The feeling that someone saw him and wasn't afraid. Sometimes, familiarity can quickly turn into something else, especially when the right song comes on at the right time. Nia Traylor never intended to be a housekeeper. Her dream was to be a first-grade teacher because, as she said, kids that age still believe in magic and think grown-ups know everything. But life does not follow a plan, and everything changed after a car accident in 2007. It was a rainy Sunday in Georgia, and her husband, Leonard, was driving the family home from church in their old Honda Civic. Unexpectedly, a truck ran a red light and slammed into their car, hitting the passenger side. Leonard was killed instantly. 3 days later, Nia woke up in the hospital with bruised ribs, a dislocated shoulder, and a 4-year-old son who had stopped speaking. That was Lenel. Her older son, Kendrick, had been in the back seat and only suffered emotional trauma. After losing her husband, Nia had to rebuild her life from scratch. She moved in with her sister, taking on odd jobs like washing dishes, doing laundry for others, and even working as a part-time janitor. She never complained. Still, every day, she talked to her sons. Even when Lenel was silent and Kendrick was difficult, she persisted in talking to them, singing to them, and loving them. "I know what silence feels like," Nia told Theo while polishing the banister. "But I also know that silence is not the end. Not if someone is still talking to you, like you're right in the middle of a conversation." When she arrived at the Prescott mansion, Nia had no degree or impressive resume. She only brought what life had taught her. That the quietest children are listening, that people heal when they are seen, and that sometimes persistence is the most powerful medicine. In her first days in Connecticut, Nia felt like she had been dropped into a foreign world. The massive house had fingerprint-activated doors and a refrigerator that talked. Her first night, she walked through the kitchen and muttered, "This place has more buttons than a space shuttle." But she was not discouraged. She quickly found her rhythm: wake up at 6:30 a.m., make breakfast at 7 a.m., vacuum the east wing before 9 a.m., and clean the bedrooms before noon. Everything was in its proper place. The person Nia paid the most attention to was Theo. She knew he liked his scrambled eggs soft and his toast cut into triangles. She knew he would only wear dark blue socks, hated overhead lights, and preferred the curtains to be open just enough to let the sunlight in. This wasn't spoiling him, it was subtle observation, and Theo noticed. One night, while tidying up the kitchen, Nia felt a gentle touch on her elbow. She turned to see Theo in his wheelchair, holding an Otis Redding record. She smiled softly and took it from him. "You want me to play this tomorrow?" Theo gave a slight nod. "All right," she whispered. "We'll listen to a little bit of Otis. Based on your request, here is the translated text, tailored for a native English-speaking audience and suitable for platforms like YouTube." The next morning, as promised, Nia placed the record on the player. The warm, raspy voice of Otis Redding filled the room. Nia, wearing old slippers and an apron, started swaying to the music. She didn't look at Theo, wanting him to feel free without any pressure. She closed her eyes, turning in one circle, then two. When she opened her eyes, she saw Theo standing in the doorway. He had left his wheelchair, his hands gripping the banister, his legs shaking, and his face pale. But his eyes were locked on her. "Little one," she whispered, "don't be scared. I'm right here." Theo didn't fall, and he didn't run. He just stood still. Nia didn't panic. She just kept dancing. Slowly, gently, patiently, as if the floor was telling a story that only the two of them knew. Nia hummed a soft melody from her childhood lullabies, held a colorful ball just within Theo's reach, and whispered, "Come on, son. You can reach it. Feel the ground beneath you. It's as steady as your own heartbeat." Theo's face, usually scrunched with effort, broke into a hesitant smile. His small hands pushed against the floor, his knees slightly bent. It was a tiny movement, but it made Alexander's heart pound. This was a bigger step than any specialist had achieved in months. She was completely focused on the boy. Her method followed no curriculum, no charts, no equipment, just simple games drawn from her own childhood in a nurturing home where material things were scarce but imagination was plentiful. As Theo wiggled his body forward, giggling after the rolling ball, Alexander entered. His voice was a mix of awe and disbelief. How did you do it?" Nia looked up, unwavering, her dark eyes meeting his with a quiet confidence. "Mr. Voss, it wasn't about doing it. It was about being there. Theo was waiting for someone to meet him where he was, not where we wanted him to be. Based on your request, here is the translated text, tailored for a native English-speaking audience and suitable for platforms like YouTube." For the first time, Charles looked at Nia with a challenging gaze. "You need to tell me what happened. What did you do? Did you pull him up? Did you stage this?" Nia remained still. "Sir, was that safe? What if he fell? I didn't touch the boy," she replied. "Did you not encourage him? I danced. He watched. That's all." Charles leaned forward. "You expect me to believe that my son stood up for the first time in his life, just because you danced?" Nia looked him directly in the eyes, unafraid. "I don't expect you to believe, but I do expect you to listen. That boy has been surrounded by people who talked about him as if he weren't in the room. Doctors, therapists, even you. They looked at him through the lens of what he could not do, not what he could." She leaned back. "I did not push him. I just showed up every day and treated him like a person, not a patient." "And you think that's all it took?" Charles narrowed his eyes. "No, I think that's all he needed." There was a long silence. Charles looked down at his hands, rubbing his palms. Her words had reached him because they weren't wrong. Nia stood up. "I'm not trying to take credit for your son's progress, but I'm not going to pretend he didn't take those steps on his own. I just danced." Charles rose slowly. His voice softened. "I've spent millions of dollars on the best people, and you're saying he just needed someone to talk to him? No, I'm saying he needed someone to see him and notice him." He didn't reply, just walked to the liquor cabinet and poured himself a glass. Nia waited a moment and then turned to leave. But before she reached the door, his voice came again, quieter this time. "Why the music? Why do you always play those records?" Nia smiled gently. "Because songs don't ask for anything. They don't demand that you move or get disappointed when you stay still. They just exist. And sometimes, when you're ready, your body listens on its own." That evening, Charles sat back in the living room. He reviewed the footage, Theo watching, Nia dancing, and then those slow, trembling, but real steps. Upstairs, Theo couldn't sleep. He stared at the ceiling, trying to find the words for what he was feeling. He thought about Nia's singing, the way she moved, and how she never demanded anything, yet made him feel like he could. He closed his eyes and whispered into the air, "I'm not scared anymore." The conversation lasted into the evening. For the first time in years, Charles cancelled meetings, captivated by Nia's insights and resilience. Laughter lingered in the house, marking the beginning of a shift where impossibility was slowly giving way to hope. Outside, the rain had tapered off, as if the sky itself had acknowledged the internal change within the home. Charles reflected on his wife's words, to cherish the moments, not the milestones. The words he had once dismissed in his grief now resonated as Nia breathed life into old routines. Theo's small victories were a prelude to a larger transformation. The silent house was being awakened, not by grand gestures, but by the subtle power of connection. Nia returned to her room with a renewed sense of purpose, unaware that her simple actions had challenged Charles's worldview, which had been defined by privilege and isolation. His phone buzzed with missed calls, but this time he did not answer, prioritizing the boy who had just shown him his first glimmer of hope. The mansion no longer felt imposing, but rather like a canvas for new beginnings. As night fell, Charles tucked Theo into bed, lingering longer than usual, whispering promises of presence. The child's peaceful sleep was a living testament to the day's miracle. Nia heard from the hallway, smiled gently, and quietly withdrew. The awakening chapter had laid the groundwork for deeper discoveries about trust and healing in the days to come. The next morning, Charles came downstairs earlier than usual. He found Nia stirring porridge in the kitchen and Theo sitting at the table with a coloring book. "Morning," Charles said, his voice husky. Nia nodded. "Good morning, Mr. Prescott." He walked over to the table and looked at the drawing. "Is that a record player?" Theo offered a small smile. "He says he wants to learn how to use mine," Nia said without turning around. Charles nodded. "Maybe we should get him his own." He didn't look at her, but continued, "If he's going to stand, he might as well learn to dance, too." However, before their new routine could fully settle, Nia had one more truth to share. Something she hadn't spoken about since her husband's death. It was a cool Sunday morning. Nia stood by the flower bed, her hands buried in the soil, not to garden, but simply to feel it. She had done this since the accident, as a way of reminding herself that she was still here, still breathing, still grounded. Theo quietly wheeled himself over to her side. He said nothing, just watched for a moment before speaking softly. "Miss Nia." She turned, wiping her hands on her apron. "Yes, little one? Can I ask you something?" "Any time." The boy looked down at the ground and then back up. "After something bad happens, are you ever scared to talk again?" She didn't answer right away. Instead, Nia pulled out a folded, old, yellowed piece of paper from her apron pocket. It was a drawing, 2 boys, a man with a crooked smile, and her in a triangular dress with long arms. "My son Lennel drew this when he was 5, she said softly. "A year after the accident." She handed the picture to Theo. He stopped talking after his dad died for an entire year, but every week he would draw pictures like this. It was his way of telling me he was still there. Theo ran his fingers lightly over the small stick figures. Nia knelt down in front of him, getting to his eye level. "I was scared every single day," she said, "but not because he was silent. It was because I didn't know if he would feel safe enough to come back." She paused. "Have you ever felt that way? Like the words are stuck?" Theo nodded. She smiled. "That's okay. The words will come when they're ready. And until then, you just keep living, keep dancing, keep listening." Something else had begun to take root in the Prescott house. Theo wasn't just standing anymore. He was walking, slowly, a few steps each day. Some days were harder than others, but he kept trying. He was also talking more. Short sentences, still quiet but clearer, and always to Nia. Charles, for the first time in years, was home more often. He stopped scheduling back-to-back calls, sitting in the living room, listening to the records, asking Theo what he was drawing, and even tried to dance once. It was stiff and terrible. Theo laughed, a big, hearty laugh. Charles looked at Nia and said, "That's worth more than any deal I've ever signed." She just nodded and handed him another record. 3 weeks later, Charles asked Nia to stay on full-time, not as a housekeeper, as Theo's companion, aide, whatever title she wanted. She smiled. "I'll stay," she said, "but no title, just Nia." One night, after Theo was in bed, Charles and Nia sat at the kitchen table with coffee. He looked at her and asked the question he had been avoiding for weeks. "Why did you come here from Georgia?" She stared at her coffee cup for a long time, then said, "Because after Lionel died, I needed to feel like I could still reach someone." He froze. "Lionel died?" She nodded slowly. 3 years ago, a sudden asthma attack. He was gone before the ambulance arrived. Charles said nothing. What could he say? Nia looked at him gently. "I don't talk about it much. It still hurts. But when Elmer called me about this job, saying there was a little boy who never smiled, I felt like something was pulling me here." Charles's voice was a whisper. "You saved him." Nia shook her head. "He saved me." That night, Nia stood in Theo's doorway, watching him sleep, his legs curled up, his chest rising and falling slowly and steadily. She whispered, "Thank you, little one, for letting me in," and turned off the light. Sometimes the people we least expect are the ones who change everything. Sometimes healing doesn't come from a clinic or a manual. Sometimes it's a song, a quiet room, a woman with tired feet and an open heart, and a little boy who was finally ready to stand up. If this story meant something to you, please share it. You never know who needs to hear it.